Okay, you're live.
It's
Okay.
a custom live streaming service. Yeah.
Okay. Dimitri, please go ahead.
Good afternoon, everyone. Or good morning if you happen to be in North America, and good evening if you happen to be in Beijing. This is Dimitri Lascaris coming to you from Cyprus. I'd like to welcome you to our panel discussion on a saga known in Canada as the Two Michaels, or depending on what your focus might be, the Meng affair. And today I'm going to be joined and honored to be joined by Victor Gao, Radhika Desai, and Keith Bennett. Before introducing my co-panelists to you, I'd just like to briefly summarize what we're here about. The story begins in December 2018 when Canadian authorities arrested Meng Wanzhou in Vancouver. Meng was the chief financial officer of a critically important Chinese technology company, Huawei. Days later, Chinese authorities arrested two Canadian men, Michael Kovrig, who was on leave from Global Affairs Canada, and entrepreneur Michael Spavor. Canada claimed that there was no basis to arrest either of the Michaels and that China was simply retaliating for the arrest of Meng, which was done at the request of the administration of Donald Trump, who sought the extradition of Meng to the United States to face criminal charges there. So today we're going to discuss recent developments in the saga and what these developments mean geopolitically and also in terms of the domestic politics of Canada. Before giving you a more detailed timeline of the events that led us here, I'd like to introduce my co-panelists. Keith Bennett is a researcher and consultant on China's international relations and co-editor of the Friends of Socialist China platform. He's also a longtime specialist on the DPRK. He has visited China regularly since 1981 and the DPRK regularly since 1983. And I understand he's joining us this evening from the United Kingdom. Or of geopolitical economy at the University of Manitoba, a prolific and published writer and author. She also served as the chairperson of my platform committee when I ran to be the leader of the Green Party of Canada in 2020, a contest which I came perilously close to winning, but thankfully it didn't turn out that way. And finally, Victor Gao, our honored guest, is a leading Chinese international relations expert. Among other degrees, Victor has a Juris Doctor from Yale Law School and a master's in international relations from the Political Science Department of Yale Graduate School. He is a guest professor at the Law School of Soochow University and is a member of the board of directors of that university. He's also a member of the International Advisory Board of the Energy Intelligence Group in London and an advisor to the very large, prominent company Saudi Aramco. And before handing this discussion over to Victor to begin, I'd like, for the benefit of our audience, to give you a somewhat more detailed timeline of this international controversy. The whole affair began in August of 2018 when a New York court issued a warrant for the arrest of Meng. In December 1st, Canadian authorities arrested her at Vancouver's airport after an extradition request by the Trump administration. The news becomes public a few days later. Then, immediately following the demanded that Canada release Meng and, quote, immediately correct, closed quote, that Canadian officials made in arresting her. On December 7th, Meng appeared in a Vancouver court where allegations of fraud were laid out. The U.S. alleged, and this is quite important, that Meng misled American banks in a bid to get around American sanctions on Iran. This was not a claim that she violated Canadian law or Chinese law or any other law but those of the United States. Then on December 10th, so this was within 10 days of the arrest of Meng, Chinese authorities arrested two Canadian men, Michael Kovrig, who was on leave from Global Affairs Canada, and Michael Spavor. Kovrig's arrest became public on December 11th. On the following day, Meng was released on $10 million bail. Then we go to 2019. In January of that year, at a news conference, China's prosecutor General Zhang Jun says Kovrig and Spavor, without a doubt, violated Chinese law. And then on the 9th, Chinese envoy in Ottawa, this is the 9th of January of 2019, suggested Canada and its Western allies I would completely agree with this observation, by the way, are white supremacists for calling for the release of 2 Canadians imprisoned last month by his country's communist government. China demanded the U.S. drop the request for extradition. And then in response to that demand, the U.S. Department of Justice effectively thumbing its charges against. And later that month, the Canadian government said it had received a formal request for extradition. In March of that year, Meng's defense team announced it had filed a notice to civil claim alleging serious violations of their client's constitutional rights. In March, also, Huawei pled not guilty in New York court. In May of 2019, Canadian diplomats are joined in a Chinese courtroom by American, British, French, and German colleagues to watch an appeal relevant to this case. Then we fast forward to 2020. In June of that year, China charged Kovrig and Spavor with spying. On August 11th of 2020, Michael Spavor was sentenced to 11 years in prison on national security charges. In September 24th, Meng pled not guilty in a U.S. court after reaching an agreement with the American government over something called a deferred prosecution agreement, basically not admitting guilt. And on the 24th, the U.S. extradition request was dropped, finally allowing Meng to recover her freedom. And the last chapter, the one that I think prompted us all to decide that this was a discussion we should be having, is that in November of 2023, so now some 3 years after Meng finally recovered her freedom, Michael Spavor publicly blamed his fellow prisoner, Michael Kovrig, for his Chinese detention, alleging that he was used, Kovrig, for intelligence gathering. So now the two supposed victims of a Chinese retaliatory measure are at war with each other, and one is being explicitly accused essentially of what the Chinese government had accused him of to begin with. And that brings us now to our analysis, and I'd like to invite Victor to begin the discussion.
Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone, and greetings to all the other panelists. I think we are gathered here tonight. I'm in Beijing in a very important and amusing discussion. I think there are so many things involved in this situation, and I'm not going to go into all the details. Suffice to make several very important points. One is that the U.S. dropped the extradition request, and eventually Meng Wanzhou became a free man again. She is back in China. She's been very successful, and Huawei has really bounced back, and it's leading the charge of technological renovation and innovation in many important respects. The United States and some of its allies have bombarded Huawei or Meng Wanzhou with a lot of accusations of espionage or threat against national security. They have failed in coming up with any substantiated accusation against either Huawei or Meng Wanzhou. That's the first point. The second point is that while the Chinese government has insisted from the very beginning that the arrest of the two Michaels of Canada have nothing to do with the arrest by the Canadian authority of Meng Wanzhou and the requested extradition of Meng Wanzhou back to the United States, my personal view is that philosophically, under the heaven, everything is related to everything else. I'm not going to contradict the statement of the Chinese government, but we should bear in mind this philosophical point. And the fact that the two Michaels and Meng Wanzhou were kind of released and flown out of Canada for Meng Wanzhou and for the two Michaels out of China, almost highly synchronized on the same day, indicated there must be something related to these two cases, while the Chinese government has insisted that they are not related. Now, the third point is that the Canadian government has insisted from the very beginning of the arrest of the two Michaels that these two Michaels had nothing to do with intelligence or espionage. And I think for a while, the rest of the world, especially the Western world, seemed to be completely siding by the representations of the Canadian government. Now, it has been quite a few years after Meng Wanzhou came back to China and the two Michaels went back to Canada, and I'm very happy for the two Michaels. After all, they were in the Chinese system for about 1,000 days, and I hope they have thoroughly enjoyed their freedom back in Canada. And now the very important point, that is, the two Michaels are now at kind of a litigation against each other, and Mr. Spavor clearly insisted that he was misused by Mr. Kovrig for gathering intelligence for the Canadian government. Now, we do not need to go into every aspect of their representations against each other. Suffice it to say, now I think the rest of the world will be able to have the better version of the truth. And the truth, philosophically, is always an evolving thing. It's like an onion. It depends on how many peels you can peel off from the onion. Is that right? So I think my point is that eventually it ended up with great pleasure for the two Michaels back in Canada enjoying their freedom, and for Madam Meng Wanzhou back in China as one of the very successful high-tech executive in China as well as in the world. And for whatever legal problems there are between the two Michaels and between the two Michaels versus the Canadian government, I hope there is a process in Canada, and hopefully the Canadian government will do the right thing to compensate the two Michaels for whatever they did in China. And I think the Canadian government probably is also very much concerned about the continued litigation between the two Michaels and against the Canadian government for more details to be thrown out into the open, which may or may not reflect well on either the Canadian system or on the representations they made for so many years about what the two Michaels were doing in China. And I hope eventually the dust will settle and the world will be restoring peace and quietness. And eventually China and Canada will get along with each other, and China and the United States will eventually embrace what I've been called the inevitability of peace between China and the United States. And on this occasion, finally, also allow me to emphasize one point, and that is this technological war against China is not making any sense, because China is here, China is growing, and China is making its own important technological strides forward. And eventually, China and the United States need to get along with each other. And I hope in that overall context, Canada will play a role of good offices rather than betting everything on the American side against China, especially if China is not doing the wrong thing, and especially if China is doing amicable things for the progress of technology and for international cooperation. I will stop here, and I will be all ears listening to the other panelists.
Thank you so much, Victor. I believe I'm going to invite now Keith to speak. And Radhika, please forgive me if I've gotten the order wrong, but as I recall,
No, that's right.
Keith would be following Victor. So please go ahead, Keith.
Well, thank you very much, Dimitri, and hello, everyone. I gather that the format of this meeting is really to a kind of interview with Victor, but I'd like to put forward a couple of observations or thoughts of my own, and perhaps Victor might be kind enough to give his views or impressions of or further comment on what I have to say. I'd like to begin by saying that I completely agree with Victor when he says that everything is connected to everything else, rather than there being no connection at all. Everything is connected to everything else is a kind of very basic and simple principle of dialectics, as I understand it. What I would next say is that when the recent controversy and talk of accusations being made by one of the Michaels about the other of the Michaels, and talk of compensation being demanded or negotiated with the Canadian state, and the things that then the allegations made that connected it to seeking information about the DPRK and sharing this with the Canadian government and the Five Eyes. The only thing that really surprised me in any way about this was that it came out into the public domain in this way, and that it came out so quickly, relatively quickly, just a couple of years afterwards. As you know, as you pointed out when you introduced me at the start of this panel, I've also followed DPRK affairs over the years in some considerable detail, and so Michael Spavor's name was familiar to me before before the arrests in China. And the reason is, of course, that through the connection with the basketball player Dennis Rodman, who visited the DPRK, I think 3 times, and 2 of those trips Michael Spavor was instrumental in. Michael became one of the very, very few Westerners to not only have met Kim Jong-un, but actually to have hung out with him, for want of a better term, to have spent time socializing. People talk about drinking cocktails on yachts and so on. And I think that first of all, considering the political and security situation around the Korean Peninsula, any information, any first-hand information about Kim Jong-un of any type will be considered as like gold dust by people in the Five Eyes countries whose business it is to try and gather that sort of information. So that begs the question of why would the Chinese authorities choose to arrest those particular people? As I understand it, there were at that time around 200 Canadians in custody for one reason or another. Anyway, there is said to be 300,000 Canadians living in China. Although the overwhelming majority of them are in Hong Kong, still that's obviously a substantial number living on the mainland. So the question is, if the Chinese were just going to pick 2 people at random, as like their names have been pulled out of the hat in a raffle or something, which is how it was presented to some extent in the Western media, why would it be those particular people? China DPRK relations are very complicated, and they've had their ups and downs over the years. But at the time they were of the 2 Michael's arrests, China DPRK relations were good. They weren't strained. They'd actually come through a period of stress and strain, and but those relationships were good. We're talking around the time that Kim Jong-un was coming to China fairly frequently. Xi Jinping was visiting Pyongyang. Xi Jinping's plane was being used to fly Kim Jong-un to Singapore, and so on. So to actually arrest somebody who was on friendly terms with Kim Jong-un is not something I think that the Chinese authorities would have done lightly at that stage. And I know that Michael Kovrig has joined the meeting, and he said in the chat that several statements are false, but the one statement of his that I came across in preparing for this meeting, and he can say whether it's a correct statement or not, is he wrote, "In both of my roles, one area I worked on was trying to engage China in an effort to get the North Koreans to stop," what did you try to get them to stop doing? "Developing and proliferating nuclear weapons and missile technology." There isn't any evidence that North Korea is proliferating its nuclear weapons, as far as I know. But anyway, and he goes on, "So, of course, we were interested in better understanding the DPRK. That involved talking with people who were knowledgeable about the country, doing analysis and making recommendations." Is it not possible, that's perhaps a thought I'd like to leave with Victor, is it not possible that this might at least have been interpreted by the Chinese government in certain ways, given the overall sensitivity of these issues to all the parties concerned?
Should I try to answer this very important question, or should I wait for the other panelists to make their point?
Please feel free to respond now, Victor. We
Okay.
don't want to
Thank you very much.
Allow
me to mention several points. First of all, I personally do hope that denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula can be achieved. But as former president, then the incumbent president Donald Trump found out in Hanoi when he met with Mr. Kim, it will not be able to be achieved if the United States wants to have the denuclearization proceeding ahead of the signing of a peace treaty between the United States and DPRK. Therefore, let's do the thing in the right sequence. Let's really make sure that there are conditions for denuclearization, and it really takes multiple parties to tangle together. DPRK and the United States, very importantly, and there need to be reassurance for each side to make sure that denuclearization will be achieved in real substantive way rather than a ploy to trick somebody into a trap so that you may follow up with a war against DPRK or regime change, etc. So I think we can talk separately about the denuclearization. I'm a big fan for the real substantive denuclearization if we can line up all the necessary things together. Secondly, we all know that China accused the two Michaels, including Mr. Spavor, of espionage. Now, if the two Michaels, when they went back to Canada, just disappeared below the radar screen and engaged in other identities or started to do other things, maybe the West will continue to blame China for using espionage charges against the two Michaels without a reason. But now, let us be really honest about this. I think the litigation between the two Michaels and against the Canadian government and the over-eagerness of the Canadian government to step in to compensate the two Michaels, etc., really indicated that the two Michaels were doing something very highly classified, even as far as the Canadian government is concerned. Now, thirdly, very importantly, I think China has its own laws and regulations, and they use their own due process and legal process to accuse the two Michaels of espionage and to bring them to the Chinese justice. Now, you may agree or disagree with what this Chinese justice is, but backed up about what happened subsequent to the two Michaels went back to Canada and the legal case involved, as I mentioned, it is clearer, at least, that the Chinese government didn't really fish around and try to come up with a fabricated case against the two Michaels. Now, the third point is that whether China will view whatever the two Michaels were doing in China as innocent things, for example, rather than involving espionage, according to Chinese law and regulations, that question is not left by the Canadians to decide. It's left by it's left to the Chinese to decide whether the Chinese espionage law has been involved. So my point is that let's focus on doing the right thing to achieve real denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula, really bringing peace and stability to the Korean Peninsula. And the United States will need to really engage with DPRK to talk about peace and discontinue with all these high-pressure measures, sailing the nuclear submarine and flying the strategic bombers very close to DPRK, for example. Let's do the right thing to calm down the situation on the Korean Peninsula. That's one thing. Secondly, I personally hope whatever the litigation or the legal problems involving the two Michaels and between the two Michaels and the Canadian government will be resolved very amicably as quickly as possible, because I think the world and mankind are very busy following other major events. You have wars happening in different parts of the world. Whatever that's involving the two Michaels were already past. It's no longer the hot issues facing China or Canada or the rest of the world. I just personally hope the two Michaels will become very much normal citizen, and they will need to do whatever they need to do in going through the legal process. And hopefully they will be happy with the compensation to be eventually granted by the Canadian government. And let the historians down the road 50 years from now to write a book about what exactly happened to the two Michaels. For us, the current generation, we need to be very busy and engaged with hot burning issues that we are faced with. We have a war in Ukraine. We have war in Gaza. We have slaughtering of innocent people. More than 20,000 innocent Palestinians have been killed. 75% of them were women and children. So let's focus on the other things. But for the two Michaels, I personally give them all the good wishes. And I do hope China, Canada, and the United States and all the other countries who care about peace and stability on the Korean Peninsula will do the right thing to create conditions for denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula to be achieved, while lasting peace will be achieved between DPRK and the United States and Republic of Korea.
Thank you, Victor. Can you all hear me? Because I think my signal has been breaking up a little bit.
You
can all
have
hear
been going in and out a little bit, but so far it's been okay.
Okay. Thank you very much, Victor. So I'd like to invite now Radhika to offer her observations and pursue this further with Victor.
Sure. Thanks again, and Dimitri. And let me I think I want to make about 5 points relatively quickly. So first of all, I think that it's very important, of course, I mean, I think, Victor, you've been talking about the two Michaels, but it seems, particularly in light of the recent revelations about what Michael Spavor is saying about Michael Kovrig, that there is a big difference between them. I mean, as far as I see it, Michael Spavor has had a very long-standing good relationship with the North Korean leader, with Kim Jong-un, enjoying privileged access to him as very, very few Westerners have. And there is absolutely no doubt that this was one of the reasons, and that having struck up a friendship with Michael Kovrig, he ended up revealing certain things to Michael Kovrig, which then in the event were reported to the Canadian government, and therefore he, according to him at least, unwittingly became involved in allegedly spying and was therefore arrested by the government. And I think that until we know any better, this seems to me to be a perfectly plausible story. The second thing I want to say is that there's some kind of very peculiar change has taken place in the whole apparatus of intelligence gathering. When, during the Cold War, you had a real sort of spying system. John le Carre wrote about it. Many other people have written various things about it. And we have gotten to know more with revelations that have come out over the decades and so on. But today, it seems to me that so-called intelligence gathering is inevitably deeply connected with the spreading of disinformation, fake news, etc., so that the purpose of collecting information is actually, or allegedly collecting, is to actually contribute to the public discourse and manufacturing certain types of so-called information or disinformation, etc. And that is the purpose even of one of the outfits that Michael Kovrig used to work for, the so-called International Crisis Group, which is very closely connected with the US establishment, the warmongering, military-industrial complex, etc., So in that sense, I think that that's partly why there is a certain sort of gray zone has emerged about exactly who is doing what, so that a person does not have to be employed by a spy agency, by the CIA, to actually perform this function. And that's what they're doing. And I think that there's also, this really shows that there's something odd going on where so-called national security is no longer, or national security is no longer the purpose of these things. It is actually to engage in an assault on certain countries that have the temerity to stand up to the US-imposed so-called rules-based international order and so on. And Canada, particularly since 2018, which is the year these events began, has essentially been wheedled into cooperating fully with the United States. And I say wheedle because it seems as though many people have argued that before 2018, Canada still maintained a policy of relative independence vis-a-vis the United States in terms of its foreign policy, but probably through a complex set of reasons, not excluding the fact that at that time, Trump was holding the stick of tearing up NAFTA and creating a new a new trade agreement, which would significantly disfavor Canada and Mexico, etc. This stick was being held over the Canadian government. And so the Canadian government essentially bowed to these demands, including the arrest of Meng Wanzhou, etc., which, as I remember from the time, many other countries have been requested to arrest Meng Wanzhou and extradite her to the United States, but they all refused, but Canada agreed. So I think that this 2018 is a very important turning point. And I think that since that time, this whole anti-China stance has become deeply embedded in the politics of both the United States and in a slightly different way of Canada. In the United States, the anti-China rhetoric has a couple of purposes to perform. First of all, the US economy is not working well for the overwhelming majority of ordinary Americans. And their sort of allegiance to the two-party system that they have is deeply shaken. And Trump found the best way, I would say, of trying to deal with it, best from the point of view of US ruling classes, is essentially to say your problems are caused by China. And this was such a compelling way of doing things that when Biden came to power, he has continued these. So the Americans are being told that their problems are not caused by the neoliberal economic policies being pursued by the US government for the last 4 decades and more, but rather they have been caused by China, which this is complete rubbish, but that is what Americans are being asked to believe. Many of them don't believe it, which is also why the ability of the two parties to win elections is radically in question. And we will see all the ructions out of that in the coming year as we approach the US elections. In Canada, however, once having submitted to this a US approach, it seems as though enough of the elites of all the major parties have become absorbed in a sort of political dynamic where essentially, even if the government wished to relent on this very anti-China posture that it has taken over the last 5-6 years, the opposition parties will not allow them to do it. They will accuse them of being soft on China, etc. And so this has again been, and in Canada also, of course, the same neoliberal policies, although they are slightly milder in Canada, but nevertheless only slightly, the same neoliberal policies have created the same sort of disaffection from the political class. And so the political class is again mired in producing this kind of, China is our problem, national security is threatened by China, etc. rhetoric as a substitute for talking about what really ails Canada as well, which is its own version of neoliberal policy. So I would say that those were the main points I wanted to make. And I would love to hear what Victor, as well as Keith and Dimitri, think about it. Thanks.
If I may start, Radhika, you are making very important points, and generally speaking, I always highly admire your points and benefit from your wisdom. A couple of points very quickly. First of all, if you really believe in the so-called national security accusations, the United States is leveling at China, then you need to really be reminded of one member of US Congress who accused the Chinese exported garlic of being a threat to the US national security interest. Come on, a garlic is a garlic. You may decide not to eat a garlic, but to accuse Chinese exported garlic to the United States as a national security threat, come on, it's a complete lack of trust and confidence in the United States. And this is not a good way to make America great again. I think it really belittles whatever the United States is standing if you buy such accusations. Now, the US President Joe Biden signed a kind of document, try to replace all the cranes being used at US ports. Because China is the biggest manufacturer and exporter of these cranes used at the ports. They asked all these cranes to be replaced by Japanese made cranes. Now, one important thing, one very important port authority in the United States came up emphasizing that they do not see any national security risk in these cranes manufactured and imported from China. Cranes are just cranes. How can you really consider these China-made cranes as a threat to the national security interest of the United States? I think there is an overshoot in Washington about whatever that they can come up with as a national security risk. Now, on the other hand, being maximum hostile to China is actually the wrong thing to do. Now, if being maximum hostile to China will really solve the American problems, then you may be tempted to doing that, even though it's not the right thing to do. However, the reality is that hostility against China doesn't solve the problems the American people are faced with. Actually, sometimes it makes whatever they are faced with even worse. And we need to be very realistic and pragmatic between China and the United States. We need to get along with each other. I firmly believe between China and the United States, war is not and should not be an option, as the late Dr. Henry Kissinger emphasized again and again in the latter few years of his life. And therefore, if we really conclude that war is not and should not be an option between China and the United States, because otherwise, if a war between China and the United States, it will really bring us to Armageddon. What's the fun of facing Armageddon, not only for one people or two peoples, but for mankind as a whole? And therefore, whatever problems there are between China and the United States, we need to really solve them through peaceful discussions, negotiations, etc. Maximum pressure against China is not going to solve the problem. China is already larger as an economy than the United States if we use purchasing power parity. And if you really listen and believe in what Elon Musk had to say, he kept saying by the middle of this century, the size of the Chinese economy will be doubling that of the United States. Come on, that day is not too far away, and it may happen, as Elon Musk has mentioned. I, generally speaking, believe in Elon Musk, and I think he really has a very extraordinary, peculiar way of looking into the future. Now, between China and Canada, allow me to emphasize, Chinese people really like the Canadian people. There was this Dr. Norman Bethune, which has been a household name in China. He is a truly good representative of the Canadian people and sometimes of the Western world at large. So we want to maximize using such goodwill between China and Canada. Now, if the Canadian government did what they did about the two Michaels, allow me to mention, either the Canadian government didn't have the truth about what the two Michaels were doing in China, which in itself will be unfortunate, or they didn't tell the truth about what the two Michaels were doing in China, because the later events, subsequent events, revealed fully that the Canadian government should have known what the two Michaels were doing, and they are now very eager to make the compensation to hush whatever the two Michaels might, in the heat of their litigation, bring out into the open, which may not reflect on the integrity of the Canadian government, because they didn't tell the whole world what they should have known, and they were trying to misrepresent the real situation to the whole world. Now, what lesson the Canadian government will eventually learn from their handling of the two Michaels, that's a separate thing. Let's leave it to Ottawa to decide. Allow me to emphasize one very important point. I believe Canada can be a good officers between Washington and Beijing. Why? Because the United States or Washington may get two things completely wrong and confused. Washington is worried that the size of the Chinese economy will catch up with that of the United States, which, depending on how you measure the sizes of the US economy versus the Chinese economy, China is already much larger than the United States, as if we use purchasing power parity for 2023, China produced more than 30 million automobiles. It's almost doubling the size of the US automobile production. China's the largest EV producer in the world and the largest exporter of EV cars. In terms of iron and steel, shipbuilding, cement, concrete, you name it, there are about 200 important items that China's production is not only larger than that of the United States, the Chinese production is about 50% of the global production. Therefore, I think from the US perspective, they need to be pragmatic as to what China is really about, and they should not worry about the Chinese economy catching up with that of the United States, because the Chinese economy is already larger than that of the economies, size of the US economy in different categories. Now, what's disturbing is the second nightmare that Washington seems to be indulging in. That is, they worry that if the Chinese economy, depending on how they define it, will be larger than that of the United States, China will be the next superpower in the world. China will be the next top dog in the world, and China will relegate the United States to a second-tier country. Now, allow me to emphasize, there is no such desire or commitment or eagerness in China to replace the United States as the top dog. We want to deal with the United States as an equal, as we want to deal with all the other about 200 countries in the world, big or small, as equal. We firmly believe countries, regardless of their size or relative importance, should deal with each other on an equal basis. Therefore, if the United States wants to be the top dog in the world, be my guest. China does not want to replace the United States as the next top dog in the world. The Chinese President Xi Jinping kept saying the Pacific Ocean is big enough to accommodate both China and the United States and many other littoral countries, of course. And now in San Francisco, President Xi Jinping of China kept saying the world is big enough to accommodate the United States and China and the United States can each become very successful in their own way. And it will be completely ludicrous for anyone in the world of today to expect that China will be completely like the United States in all the other aspects, or China wants to be the next United States, because China, which has a civilization uninterrupted and always continuous for 5,000 years, is very, very different from the United States. We are very much internally oriented. We have many huge problems we need to solve. The Chinese people were just out of poverty around 2020 when we declared to the world that we eliminated abject poverty as a phenomenon. We have so many things to do. And on a per capita basis, probably China will never even get close to that of the United States on a per capita basis during my lifetime. So no need to worry in Washington. And China and the United States, I truly believe, will enjoy this inevitability of peace. We need to get along with each other. In that overall context, what's the role for Canada? Canada should be very realistic and very pragmatic, cool-headed, rather than red-necked, for example, and be a good officers between China and the United States, rather than betting on the US war against China, because that war will destroy mankind as a whole, including the Canadians. So let's embrace peace and let's oppose war, especially any attempt of war between China and the United States.
Thank you, Victor. I would like now to offer a perspective on an issue that we haven't discussed yet, and which, from my perspective as geopolitical commentator and a lawyer, received precious little, if any, treatment in the public discourse over this entire affair. And that is the issue of the extraterritorial application of United States law. And I just want to remind everybody, and I'll be inviting Victor to comment upon this, about the specifics of this case. At the time of her arrest, Meng she was residing in China, not Canada or the United States. She was a Chinese citizen and did not hold citizenship in any other country. For 25 years, she had worked for China's largest telecommunications company as CFO and deputy chairwoman of the board. She was arrested in Canada, not in China, based on an extradition request from another country, the United States. The allegation was not that she violated even Canadian law. So she's arrested in Canada based on allegations of the Trump administration, hardly an honest actor on the world stage, that she had violated US law. And where was she alleged to have violated it? Outside of the United States, in dealings with a non-US entity. And that entity was HSBC, a massive British bank. And the allegation was that Meng had conspired to make misrepresentations to HSBC to induce HSBC to continue to provide banking services to Huawei while the company was allegedly doing business through a subsidiary in Iran, again, not the United States, which was subject to US sanctions. But as someone who looks at this from the perspective of international law, I ask a threshold question, which was, even if Meng had violated the US sanctions, what business did the United States have seeking her extradition when she had no connection to the United States? And these events that gave rise to this prosecution had no connection to the United States. And I want to point out here that the sanctions imposed upon Iran, because they have not been approved by the United Nations Security Council, are a violation of international law. They are, in fact, an act of war, an act of aggression, whatever you may think of the Iranian government, and you may have plenty of reason to criticize it. Nonetheless, the US government has imposed punishing sanctions unilaterally, as Western governments do repeatedly, outside of the context of the United Nations Charter, to which the US government is a signatory. Those sanctions have caused immense suffering to innocent Iranians. Again, even if everything alleged against the Iranian government is true, the sanctions have had a devastating impact upon innocent Iranians, the people that they were supposedly intended to protect. The sanctions are being imposed by a country that is a serial human rights violator, the United States government. And let me point out that as we are speaking, the United States government is facilitating and enabling the worst crime against humanity under international law, a genocide. Why isn't the United States being subjected to sanctions? What business does the United States government, a genocide enabler, amongst other countless violations of human rights and international law, what business does it have moralizing to any other state and trying to hold any other state accountable when its own disregard for international law and human rights is of epic proportions? And the last thing I want to say about this is that, in fact, the sanctions regime was largely a deal that the Obama administration had struck with Iran to observe with under scrutiny from the restrictions on its nuclear development program. The IAEA certified at the time that the Trump administration indicated its intention to
Yeah, just repeat the last bit, Dimitri. The
Yeah.
Trump administration from there on.
Right. So sorry about that, folks. So the IAEA certified that Iran was in compliance with the deal, and there's absolutely no evidence that Iran was violating the sanctions deal. But the Trump administration withdrew from the deal nonetheless and reimposed punishing sanctions on Iran in violation of international law. And so the question I ask here is, let's assume that everything that was alleged against Meng was true. And she denied it. There was never any adjudication by any court, American or otherwise, of her guilt. But what if it was true? What business did the United States have imposing any kind of a criminal penalty or even a civil penalty on her by means of the extraterritorial application of a United States law, which is itself a violation of international law? There was virtually no discussion of this in the public discourse. And Victor, I was kind of struck, and I may have missed it, but I was a bit surprised that the Chinese government itself, which in my view has been much more restrained about trying to apply its laws extraterritorially, really didn't focus upon this in its public commentary. It focused more on the question of innocence and whether or not there was a basis to the allegations. What do you make of this, and what is your view about the Chinese government's position with respect to the extraterritorial application of US law?
Thank you very much. Raising very important questions again. A couple of points from my side. First of all, I understand the United States made the extradition request of Meng Wanzhou to about 40 countries in the world, probably including all its allies and very close relations with the United States. Now, only Canada did what the United States wanted it to do. What does this mean? Does it mean that Ottawa was smarter than all the other 40 countries or so? Or does it mean Ottawa was dumber than the other 40 countries or so? You come to your own conclusion. That's number one. Number two is that it is absolutely clear Huawei as a company is a decent company. It's a highly pioneering company, very successful company. And its involvement in the smartphone is abiding by every law and regulations at that time in place. Now, Huawei and Meng Wanzhou are very law-abiding people and companies. And for the United States to apply this extraterritorial reach to Huawei or to Meng Wanzhou is, first of all, not founded at all. Now, I remember in the heat of the extradition case, there were very distinguished Americans who said, if this extradition can be carried out, then all the chairman and CEO of the Fortune 500 companies in the world will never be able to travel around because anyone can have them arrested or extradited to whichever country for things that they allege they are involved in. So, in a sense, conceptually speaking, such overreach of the US law and extraterritorial application of its domestic law against anyone else is not really foolproof. It's actually very much damaging the interest of free trade and market economy, you name it. Now, you need to ask why the United States was doing this. Of course, someone was urging Washington to throw a wedge into Huawei and try to kill the company. Why? Because Huawei at that time was very successful, and there are business competitors in Washington who might feel that they are threatened by the success of Huawei as a company. Now, allow me to emphasize one point philosophically. You should never build up your success on the condition of the failure or the fumbling of your competitors. You need to build up your success purely on the merit of your success, rather than betting that your competitor or your partners will fail or take a stumble. That's number one. Number two is that for China, we know what Washington is doing. We know their real motivations. And China is not eager just to expose every aspect of what the United States is doing or what former President Trump was trying to do, kill a company. When former President Trump was in the White House, he even wanted to force a fire sale for TikTok, which eventually didn't take place. And the current president, Joe Biden, wanted to deal a fatal blow to TikTok by one way or another. And what's amusing is that by the last minute, President Biden signed up with TikTok, opening up his own personal account, try to get more votes during the presidential election. I think everyone in the world should really know what the United States government is all about. There is no single version of truth in their mind. Whatever that suits their own particular purpose on the spur of the moment, they will do that. Whether they believe it is true or not, that's a separate issue. I think the Huawei situation, the Meng Wanzhou situation, really reveals the true color of Washington, because they are not really caring about the due process. They're not really caring about the integrity of these people or the presumption of innocence, for example. And they know for sure that this case will not stand because they do not have evidence which can pass the due process or the scrutiny of the law in the United States, but they still wanted to do that. They probably bet that once Meng Wanzhou was extradited to the United States, then Huawei will need to acknowledge guilt or plead guilty, for example, and then bingo, they have a case. They have an ironclad case against Huawei. They underestimated the reality on the ground. First of all, Meng Wanzhou is really an iron lady. She refused to buckle under maximum pressure from the United States and, unfortunately, from Canada. And then Huawei as a company refused to buckle. They stick to what they really believe. That is, Huawei is innocent. Huawei doesn't commit any fraud, for example. Huawei doesn't constitute any threat to the national security interests of the United States. This means that these Chinese persons and these Chinese companies, and then the Chinese nation as a whole, are very, very heroic. If you really want to touch upon the fundamental interest of these entities, they will stand up. They will fight against you. They will really fight to the last minute to prove they are innocent. Therefore, I think Washington and Ottawa should really learn the lesson that don't mess around with China, don't mess around with Huawei, don't mess around with Meng Wanzhou. And I would even go to the point of saying that whatever that happened to the two Michaels was really the responsibility of Ottawa, because they tried to be accomplice of Washington in this attempted extradition of Meng Wanzhou to the United States. Of course, the Chinese government is correct. The arrest of the two Michaels have nothing to do with the Meng Wanzhou case. But philosophically speaking, allow me to say that again, everything under the heaven are connected and are synchronized. And unfortunately, the two Michaels became the victim of whatever that Ottawa did. Try to aid and abet Washington in doing something which is completely illogical, which is backfiring, because Huawei, as I mentioned, is producing new versions of the smartphone better than the Apple phone. Can you believe it? And they have one particular device in their latest version of the smartphone, which can connect directly with a high orbit satellite, 36,000 kilometers above ground, without any extended antenna, for example. And the Americans have no way of figuring out how Huawei could do this. And they worry that if Huawei could do this in a civilian use phone, which is bought in the market for just, around $1,000, what else can China do? Now, does Washington want to jump out and accuse Huawei of stealing their secret? Chairman of Huawei, Ren Zhengfei, said the right thing. They even don't have the secrets or the patents that I have or Huawei have. How can I steal something that they don't even have? Washington even went on to the length to say Huawei is guilty of stealing intellectual properties yet to be developed by the United States. Come on. This is against the legal presumption, because the intellectual property starts with when you register that. You cannot say, you steal my intellectual properties, which I'm still working upon or thinking about, and which may be on the road several years down the road. I think we need to be very pragmatic and very realistic. We need to call a spade a spade. We need to call Huawei as a Huawei, Meng Wanzhou as a Meng Wanzhou, rather than politicizing these entities and call them threats to the national security interest of the United States. If Washington is really worried about their national security in such a way, let me tell you, everything will become a threat to the United States. Every cloud in the sky, every leaf on the tree, every drop of water, even in the big oceans, will be viewed as a threat to the national security interest of the United States. Why? Because they really wantonly generalize national security interest, and they view the 1.4 billion people in China as an enemy, for example, whereas we are perfectly happy to be friends with the Americans and with the Canadians. We want to live and let live with the Canadians and the Americans. We want to develop and promote development across the national border between our countries. That's really brings out a very important question. What is your perspective about the world? Whether you want to have peace or whether you want to agitate for war. And if you really want to agitate for war, have you really thought about what will be the consequence of war? China is not Iraq. China is not Syria. China is not a great country like Jordan, for example. China is China, and if a war between China and the United States really happen, it will lead directly to Armageddon. So wake up. Let's promote peace. And wake up, I hope, Canada. Let's help promote peace between China and the United States. If Canada is very eager to promote a war between China and the United States, holy cow. Think about the consequences for the 33 million people in Canada. Let's make sure that the Canadians, the Chinese, the Americans always live in peace, and we do our part, each of us, to promote peace rather than agitating for war. All these witch hunting, for example, that Washington is involved in against China, against Huawei, against Meng Wanzhou, is really a pretext for preparation of war. And that war will destroy mankind. And that war should be opposed by every peace-loving person in the world, including me. I always promote peace between China and the United States. I have been promoting peace between China and Canada. I even created a term called Canada-China, Canada-China, or China, or Canada-China, and then peace between China, the United States, and Canada as America-China, something like that. We need to create something that will bring peace and sanity to the Chinese people, the American people, and the Canadian people, and people at large in the world. We should all unite to oppose war. And for the two wars in Ukraine and in Gaza, let's make sure ceasefire happen tomorrow, rather than being dragged along, causing more civilian deaths. Peace is the only right choice between China and the United States. Thank you.
And I just want to add, Victor, thank you for that, those reflections. For those, who listen to our discussion today and who are convinced that China has not respected international law, is not respecting human rights, whatever your views about that subject may be, we shouldn't have any illusions about why our governments are adopting a belligerent attitude towards China. I'm going to repeat what I said earlier, and this is just the tip of the iceberg, frankly. We are witnessing Western government enabling of a genocide in Gaza. We know that the war on Iraq was a flagrant violation of international law and the United Nations Charter. We know that the United States committed heinous war crimes in Vietnam, Laos, and Cambodia, and that no one was held accountable for them. We know that Guantanamo is a violation of the fundamental laws of war and human rights. And to this very day, innocent men are being held at Guantanamo without any conviction by a court of law, even one that is not characterized by due process. So if we can agree on anything, whatever one's view may be about the Chinese government, it should at least be possible for us to agree that the belligerent posture of Western governments towards China has absolutely nothing to do with human rights or international law. It has to do entirely with hegemony. And I should also add, it should be crystal clear to us all when you look, for example, at US military spending compared to China's, and you look at the distribution of United States military bases around the world. You look at the wars of aggression that the United States has launched within our lifetimes. It should be quite clear to us all, again, whatever your views about the Chinese government's human rights and international law record may be, that it is the United States and its allies from the West that are the aggressors vis-a-vis China. We are ringing China with military bases. We are sending warships to the edge of Chinese territorial waters. We are sending spy planes to the edge of China's territorial airspace. It is not China that is doing those things. And if we're not going to restrain ourselves, and if we're not going to demand of our own governments, effectively demand that they comply with international law and human rights, we have no justification whatsoever for lecturing any other country about its behavior, whether it be China, the Russian Federation, Iran, Syria, and on and on. It's a disgrace. and it's time for us to bring to an end our own hypocrisy. I can't stress that strongly enough, and I had to get that off my chest. Now, before we continue, I thought maybe we would allow some of our audience members within the limited time available to us to ask some questions. Before we do that, I just want to see if Keith or Radhika have any other observations or questions they wanted to share with us.
Yeah, I'd like to say something, if that's okay.
Sure.
Part of it, I want to really echo what you said. We have a particularly lively, shall I say, chat box going this time. There's references to gaslighting, and but I think the only gaslighting and spamming and trolling is the activity of some people in the chat, if I can respectfully say that. And we have a reference to a description of one of the Michaels as a political hostage. What I'd like to say here is that if there is one real political hostage in this whole saga, it was Meng Wanzhou. And I just want to reiterate some of what you said, Dimitri, in that Madame Meng was transiting in Canada on her way to Mexico. She was arrested. A Chinese citizen. She was arrested. The basis for her arrest was that as a Chinese citizen, she had a meeting in Hong Kong, a part of China, with a representative of a UK bank, at which Iran was discussed. What on earth that has got? What, you know? It's just one example of thousands every day of the hegemonic attitude of the United States, where it arrogates to itself an extra territoriality. And of course, the people like to contrast the treatment of the two Michaels with what they call the rule of law, which is said to exist in our Western democracies. And where was the rule of law in the case of the treatment of Meng Wanzhou, when after she'd been arrested, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, openly talked about using her as a bargaining chip in terms of his trade and tariff struggles with the Chinese government. This is not the rule of law. This is medievalism, frankly. It undoes some of the most progressive aspects of the bourgeois revolution, apart from anything else. And there was also a very detailed article in the Wall Street Journal. I can't vouch, obviously, for the accuracy of everything, but it certainly seems a very well-informed article. I mean, the Wall Street Journal may be owned by Rupert Murdoch. Some of its op-ed contributions and letters might be terribly right-wing, but in my opinion, a lot of its news reporting is actually extremely good. And according to that, because as we know, when Madame Meng was arrested, it sort of coincided with President Xi Jinping and President Trump having dinner together in Argentina during the G20 meeting. The Wall Street Journal claims that John Bolton was interfering and pressurizing and coordinating with the Canadian government, and actually doing it even behind Donald Trump's back. So if one wants to talk about political interference, about political hostages, I think we don't have to look to China. We have to look at what was done in the United States and in Canada. I'd just like to also echo what Victor was saying about how relations between Canada and China should be, because actually until a few years ago, Canada and China had excellent relations. Okay, there may be some problems from time to time, like there can be between all countries, but basically Canada and China had excellent relations. I think there's an interesting point to be made in similarities between Canada and Australia, in that both of them are advanced developed countries, but they have economies that are still also heavily dependent on minerals and raw materials and on agriculture. And this makes their economies highly complementary to that of China. And Canada and Australia benefited immensely from the good relations that they had with China. Right through the period of the global financial crisis and so on, Australia went over 20 years without falling into recession even once. And the main reason for that was its good relations and its thriving economic relations with China. And I think it's a great pity that Canada and Australia, to a great extent, have thrown that away, even if the new government in Australia is trying to repair it to some extent. And in this regard, one could only hope that the present Canadian Prime Minister would show just a little bit of the wisdom that his father had when he pioneered and established the diplomatic relations between Canada and China. Thanks.
Thank you, Keith. And Radhika, did you have any other observations to share with us before we invite our audience members to ask some questions?
Yes, I just wanted to do what I've been doing in this, which is really to reflect on the larger scene. And but let me start by just saying that as I mentioned earlier, Michael Kovrig has joined us, which he's entirely entitled to do, and he's welcome as a member of the audience. And in my humble opinion, he can ask questions if he wants as a member of the audience on the same rules as other members of the audience. But if we had wanted to hear from him, we would have invited him. And if there was a Michael I wanted to hear from, I would have probably chosen the other one, Michael Spavor. But nevertheless, so that's my response to it. And part of my reason for saying what I'm saying is that, as I've pointed out, we are living in absolutely wall-to-wall fake news, disinformation, etc. And the kinds of groups that Michael has worked for and belonged to have been in the forefront of producing this kind of disinformation. And the reason for this is very simple. As I've emphasized in much of my writing, particularly my 2013 book, Geopolitical Economy, and my 2023 book, Capitalism, Coronavirus, and War, and this also relates to what Victor was saying earlier, everything is connected to everything else, but I want to show you how it's connected. The fact of the matter is that the saga we're talking about today, the Two Michaels saga, the Meng Wanzhou saga, etc., this is part of a larger picture which is composed of the following things. Number one, the United States is in decline, and it is in decline because, quite frankly, capitalism is done all the good work it had ever had to do, however badly it did it, but it's now even that is exhausted and it can no longer go on. And the point of neoliberalism is to keep capitalism alive, even though it becomes less productive, incapable of producing jobs, incapable of producing broad-based prosperity, incapable of addressing, in fact, only capable of massively increasing inequality. In such a context, inevitably, social division and political division are deepened. This is what has happened to all the societies, especially the US and the UK, that have pursued neoliberalism most doggedly. And this is why their politics are in such deep crisis. And in order to try to continue to inveigle people who are increasingly reluctant to vote for the establishment parties to do so, this is why the disinformation is being created. And I would say one other thing. Things have come to such a sorry pass that the big corporate interests to which these discourses, to whose rule these discourses are devoted, are increasingly very dangerous. They are either directly part of the military-industrial complex, or they need the help of the military-industrial complex imposing the West's will on the rest of the world in order to achieve their objectives. However, they cannot succeed. Victor was saying earlier, China is not Iraq. The fact of the matter is the reality of the US's defense competence is even more grave. The United States has basically not won a single war at all. It failed in Korea, it failed in Vietnam, it has failed in every other country to establish stable rule of the sort that it can live with. It has failed in all of these ways, and this despite the fact of having a military-industrial complex that consumes $1.5 trillion a year. This is a new estimate arrived at by some really interesting statisticians, which is on the MR Online website. Please go and take a look at it. So what I'm trying to say is that the United States is reacting to its own impotence with essentially a tantrum, in which it seeks to impose on the world a dominance that it has lost the capability to impose. Nevertheless, this tantrum, as Victor rightly pointed out, has the potential to bring us really close to war and nuclear war. And this is why we have to spread the alternative point of view. And that's what this webinar is all about. And thank you all for being here. And I hope many of you will share this webinar more widely. And I look forward to questions and answers and so on. Thank you.
Thank you, Radhika. And just a footnote to your commentary, $1.5 trillion a year is more than 4 times the annual military budget of China, even though China has a vastly larger population than the United States, and by the measure of purchasing power parity, has a significantly larger economy than the United States. So again, it behooves us to ask, who is the aggressor in this scenario? Now, with that, I would like to open it up to Q&A, just a couple of preliminary comments. First, I'm hopeful that Paul Graham will be able to control who is allowed to speak and not. I'll indicate, when it's time for a question or comment to stop. I'm going to limit them to 2 minutes apiece, all persons, no exceptions. And so, Paul, will you be in a position, I hope, just to ensure that the time limits are respected if I indicate that the 2 minutes are up? I'll keep the time myself.
Yeah, I can flag it.
Thank you so much. Well, I've got a timekeeper here, so I'm going to watch that. But I just, if I request that the speaker stop, then I'd just like somebody else to be able to ensure that happens. So, secondly, we will expect everybody to be respectful and to be civil, and we are not going to tolerate any insulting or ad hominem commentary. So if anybody engage, and I don't expect anybody will, but if anybody engages in that kind of commentary, we're just going to cut off that speaker and move on to the next one. And lastly, I would like to invite, I agree with Radhika that we should limit everybody to 2 minutes so that everybody has a fair opportunity to speak. But I would like to invite Michael Kovrig. I do understand he's been actively participating in the chat. If he wishes to ask a question, I'm happy to give him the opportunity to go first. I don't know if he's still with us, but I don't see any indication whether or not he's. Do we need to unmute him, Paul?
He can unmute himself.
He can unmute himself, but also you will see, Dimitri, the hands, the people who have raised hands will come up to the top of the participants list. So if you open the participants list, you will be able to see who has raised hands. So, Radhika, unfortunately, I had to switch to my iPhone because my hotel Wi-Fi. Do you want to take that? I can direct the question. So I've got Yuri and I've got Morrigan. So in that order, please go ahead, Yuri. Yeah.
Actually, just before I get to my question, Michael Kovrig says, my only question is what your agenda is in holding this webinar. That's Michael Korvig's question. So answer that first before I get to my question.
Sure. Michael, could you indicate to whom that question is directed? I'm sorry, Radhika, I'll let you go after this, but I just want to make, is that for everybody or someone in particular?
I guess it's a general question towards everyone.
Radhika, why don't you go ahead and
yeah, I mean, I think the last thing I just said earlier actually was directly presenting the reason why we decided to hold this webinar, that we need to counter the dominant narratives to which Michael Kovrig's work has contributed, the institutions that he's worked for have contributed, the mainstream media is creating, the governments are creating, and I told you the reasons why. So I think that's quite obvious. That's the reason, that's our agenda, indeed, for holding this, this webinar. But others may have something to add.
I just want to, I presume what you mean by that, Radhika, so everybody understands. Michael, he indicated this in the chat, and I think we indicated this at the outset, worked in Global Affairs Canada. And I think the organizers, if I might speak for all of us, have a rather critical view of the way Global Affairs Canada formulates and implements Canadian foreign policy. and the way it influences the public discourse in this country around international relations. That's all I have to add to answer that question. So Radhika, you want to take other questions now?
So, okay, so I've got Yuri and then Morrigan in that order. Yuri, please go. We'll take the 2 questions and then I'll go to, and if there's a third, we'll take 3 questions and then we'll go to the speakers for their reaction. Yuri, go ahead.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Professor Desai and everybody else. This has been very great. Although anywho, so I have a question for Mr. Victor or Dr. Gao. I hope I'm not butchering his name. My question is, I'm very curious if there's a large I'm very curious in China if there's a very large anti-imperialist, anti-nuclear weapons movement. Then a very quick question to Dimitri is your reflections on the legacy of former Prime Minister Brian Mulroney, who's passed away. And then a very quick question to Professor Desai, which is the ongoing persecution of Julian Assange, and whether she thinks that one way we can try to make sure that Taiwan is not weaponized in the pivot to Asia, shouldn't Taiwan be allowed to have a referendum on independence? And if they do decide to vote independence, then that must come with an agreement that they are not to have any foreign military bases or any sort of peace or any sort of military alliances or pacts with NATO, the US, Australia, and whatnot. Thank you very much.
Morrigan, please go ahead.
Hi, everyone. I'll be kind of quick, but feel free to let me know if I go over 2 minutes. I just wanted to raise the National Security Arrangement of Canada, which is the Five Eyes Alliance. It is an alliance of Western countries that share information and work together through integrated spy agencies. And actually, it's not just the spy agencies, it's multiple national security agencies. And so I want to raise a few points and then just invite everyone to kind of comment and respond to the points that I raise. When it comes to information sharing, it doesn't benefit all of the countries in this Five Eyes arrangement equally, revealing the dictate of the USA's interest, but also, and more importantly, that the laws of each country are vastly different, as well as non-NATO allies of the USA, such as Israel, which essentially doesn't have laws in terms of what kind of spy activity can be offset from the USA onto other countries like Canada or its allies. Furthermore, there's a quasi-lawless situation where one spy agency can ask another to do something that its own country would hold accountable or illegal. So the framework of this national security arrangement doesn't actually appear to serve national security interess. It's more of a political tool, and so this creates a very dangerous world where the role of spy agencies is barely national security at all. It's more like citizens of our own Western countries might be used as pawns. And actually, I'm going to get to Michael in a moment. We might look at Canada's breakdown of Saudi Arabia relations and India most recently. The problem here isn't just pragmatic diplomacy, as Gao had mentioned, but that Canada is putting Canadians in more danger than not. Such dangerous abuses of spy powers and information warfare are leading to a media blackout, the erosion of civil liberties for citizens of the Western countries like Canada. For example,
Morgan, I'm sorry. You're beyond the two-minute mark, and okay. I just wanted to, if you could close it up, and if you have a specific question, please go ahead.
Oh, sure. So just to wrap it up super quick, is just that there are real Canadian nationals who do require advocacy, and Michael was really looks like he was used as a pawn for the Canadian establishment for political purposes, like Ava Bartlett in Russia, who is on a kill list. And our government has not advocated for her in the same way that it has raised a ruckus around politically useful Canadians abroad. And so I'll wrap it up there.
And I will take a third question from Kevin Guyan.
Yes, I had a question related to this group, the International Manifesto Group, and its relationship with the University of Winnipeg. And based on the fact that we're being recorded today, will this panel be shared with other universities across Canada? Thank you.
Okay, so I'd like to open it up to answers. I think we'll begin with Victor, Dimitri, Keith, and then I will say a couple of things, and then we'll go to the next round of questions.
Thank you very much, Radhika. I'll be very quick. One gentleman mentioned imperialism. I think imperialism is dead, and anyone try to start imperialism will do so to his or her own peril and bring the national interests of the people he is from to great peril. And there is still no shock of attempts to revive imperialism for whatever reason. But I think mankind should really conclude that imperialism is dead and no one should be allowed to revive imperialism. Now, you mentioned the nuclear war. I think China is opposed to war of all kinds, and in particular, nuclear war. China has the policy of declaring that it will never use nuclear weapon against any non-nuclear weapon country or against any nuclear-free zone, and China will never be the first country to use nuclear weapon against any other country. And I hope all the other nuclear weapon countries will do the same as China has undertaken regarding this nuclear warfare. And I think eventually nuclear warfare, especially combined with the rapid development of AI, for example, if it is not handled properly, will probably bring mankind to closer brink of a disaster. So we need to take care of the nuclear weapons on the one hand, and also we need to make sure that no one will intertwine AI with nuclear weapons and launch vehicles, lest we suffer dire consequences. Thank you.
I also, Radhika, there was a question from Yuri about Brian Mulroney, which Yuri asked me to address. Shall I answer that now?
Yes, please, go ahead.
Okay. The short answer, Yuri, is that I do not share the current adulation being expressed by the mainstream media and the political elite for Brian Mulroney. I was in law school when Brian Mulroney was the prime minister, and what I remember was he was the driving force behind Canada's entry into the North American Free Trade Agreement with the United States. And in fact, there's an article in the CBC where the headline of it is Brian Mulroney remembered as a giant and trailblazer in driving free trade, so-called free trade, which isn't free at all. I don't view that as a compliment. To me, that's an insult. And that's what I remember about him the most. I also remember that he brought Canada more closely into alignment in terms of foreign policy with that of the United States than prior governments had done in my lifetime. He was part of an unholy triumvirate with Ronald Reagan and Margaret Thatcher. They had intensely neoliberal views and imperialist views about foreign policy and domestic policy. And for that reason, I do not at all think that we should be honoring this man.
Keith, please go ahead if you would like to make a rejoinder. Yeah.
I don't think any of the questions were particularly directed at me, so I'll pass on this one.
Okay, so I'll say several things. Number one, I think that one of the things I wanted to point out is that the the West really, particularly since the 2018, but certainly since the Trump administration, has insisted on something that is very important to understand, which is that they are allegedly taking a whole of society approach, which means that in the name of countering China or Russia or whatever, they expect to be able to control the discourse and even the institutions of Western societies. So in that sense, what they're doing is imposing a type of capitalist totalitarianism on us. And in this context in particular, I would like to very highly recommend a report recently written by John Price, of my former colleague at the University of Victoria. It's entitled The Five Eyes and Canada's China Panic. The subtitle is A Threat to Diplomacy, Research, and Peace in the Pacific. And he is pointing out how the events of the last many years have really demonstrated a very important change of direction in Canada, making Canada more openly subservient to an extremely destructive and ultimately vain policy that is being pursued by the United States since the advent of the Trump administration, and how it is being used to essentially control the research agenda and who gets to do what research, etc., in Canada, violating all the norms of academic freedom and allegedly the freedoms that the West claims to be in support of. So, I very much admire this work, and also, of course, John Price has done a lot of work, as has Xiaobei Chen, who I believe was here. I hope she's still here in Canada, defending the rights of Chinese Canadians and their and defending them against the sort of racism to which they have been subjected, particularly with this anti-China discourse that has become so important. So I want to emphasize that. And then finally, I'll say briefly that somebody was asking about whether this webinar will be made public. Well, it is already public. As we speak, it is being aired on YouTube, and it will remain there. We will, if necessary, produce a cleaned up copy, but I don't think we usually need to do that, but that will remain there. So it is already public. This is not a secret or private seminar. It is a public event to which all of you are welcome, and I'm glad all of you are here, and I hope lots of people will watch this afterwards. Okay, so that's me. I'm going to now, I see 4 questions, and I'm going to take all of them, and that may be the last set of questions that we get the time to do, because we usually like to bring this matters to a close within 2 hours. So I'm going to take the 4 questions. I think the first one is actually not from Linda, but from Kim-Eng Koo, and then Alan Freeman, and Linda Christian, and Simon Heim. So remember, please, 2 minutes each. Go ahead, Kim-Eng.
Okay, thank you. My question is mainly directed to Victor, because I wanted to say that U.S. and Western powers are even in their language and behavior are brutish, rude, hypocritical, aggressive, and big bullies, really. Okay, while Chinese government speaks softly and diplomatically, and even Putin says that they negotiate and they compromise. You know, the Western powers see that as a weakness, in the sense that the Chinese government is diplomatic and tactful. What has happened to Canada and all these other countries that does the work of the U.S. bullying, like Canada and UK and all that, is just a matter of course for the Western powers. So and I appreciate Lascaris' law expose on what is going on. My question with Victor is that, does the Chinese government in any way see a way of being more firm in their discourse to the West? Because this diplomatic and tactful way of speaking obviously cuts no cheese with the US government or the Western powers. But maybe China was trying to show the rest of the world. I don't know. So that was my main question. Thank you.
Thank you, Kim-Eng. Alan?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes.
Yeah. I wanted to try and ask the following question. To what extent do the participants think that it would be possible for a wider debate in which those who do not share the views of we who organized this event to take part? I see a number of obstacles to that. One of them is that we are not allowed into debates in which they are organizing. We do not get into the mainstream media. We are witch hunted, and people who share our views are witch hunted. There's a constant attempt to prevent us speaking. We are not represented in the mainstream media. The mainstream media just act as attack dogs. And I think what's happening is that situation is placed the elite in such danger that it feels threatened. And so I think that's why we see the participation in this debate of those who never in their long careers have entertained the mere idea that people who have our views should participate in their discussions. So I have 2 points. One is that I think that you should be appealed to change that, to make sure the views that we have, that is against hegemonism and against war and for peace and for justice, are expressed in the highest quarters in Canada, including in its parliament, in its media, and in the deliberations of the organizations in which you are involved and over which you have control. The second is, given that there is a tremendous fear in the elites, and we know why this is, it's because of the popular reaction to the genocide in Gaza, and it is because Ukraine is losing a war which has cost it nearly 500,000 deaths at the hands of our governments, which they didn't need to do. So people are running scared. Well, I think it is time for a public debate that goes wider, but there must be ground rules to that debate. So my question would be, how can we provide for and facilitate such a debate? That would be my question.
Thank you, Alan. Linda, please go ahead.
Yeah, I'm the real Linda Christian. I just want to say I appreciate Victor Gao very much. I agree that what is happening in the world in between Canada and China now is completely irrational and dangerous. And as a citizen of Canada, I wrote to my MP about the arrest of Meng Wanzhou. And I said, this violates international law. Why are we doing this? We need to trade with China. We're a small country. We should be trading with China and not badgering it and arresting its people. So that's my position. I cannot figure out what the facts of the case cases of the two Michaels are. I can't figure out what the evidence is exactly against them, and how can we as citizens make our government accountable to make sure that we are not doing things that our government isn't doing things against our own interests in these international in its foreign policy. And the two Michaels thing has I can't find the facts. Can somebody please enlighten me as to what the legal and evidentiary facts are in this case? Because I just can't figure it out. There's so much propaganda.
Okay, thanks, Linda. And final question to Simon. Please go ahead.
I mean, maybe I'm just way too cynical, but I'm often reminded in these sort of cases of one of the last sort of lectures that Samir Amin gave at Tsinghua. One thing that he stressed to a Chinese audience, you think that you can grow your economy, have this peaceful rise that you say you will have, and this will just happen. No, you will be fought, right? So this idea that this perhaps, there seems to me some level of naiveness of, oh my God, this is against international law. Of course it is. They will throw everything and under the kitchen sink and the kitchen sink at this. And international law is no real hindrance to this. We see this with countries that are not even rivals of the US. The case of David Mendoza, I think, comes to mind. A Spanish citizen who, relatively small charges is just grabbed and incarcerated. So I think in the case of there is actually a country behind it that will stand up for its citizens. Maybe that's too cynical.
Okay, thank you. And with apologies, Kevin, I won't take a second question from you. I will now go to the speakers for the last round of responses, and then we will bring the event to a close. So once again, Victor, we will start with you and then go to Dimitri, Keith, and then Meng.
Thank you very much, Radhika. I'll be very quick. First of all, thank you, Linda, Christian, for your nice words. I think for China and Canada, what I've been promoting is China Da, that is China and Canada. And among China and the United States and Canada, what I've been promoting is a merry China Da. So I do hope we can get along with each other and we can focus on trade and the businesses, for example, people-to-people exchanges, and rather than, for example, being really diverted from peace to agitation for war. That's very important. Now, secondly, talking about how the Chinese diplomacy or governance will be, I think philosophically, China does not want to embrace war. And China views war as really the last resort rather than the first choice. There are countries which are very gun happy. They start to shoot at any notice, for example. And China wants to exhaust diplomacy, negotiation, arbitration, whatever you can do other than war. And war should be really the last resort. And I hope other countries will reciprocate. We will use diplomacy and negotiation first and try our best to exhaust them before anything else happens. Now, in terms of hegemony and the war, I think they are very much correlated. Those countries which want to, or which continue to want to pursue hegemony, they probably will use war more as an instrument of their policies. Whereas from the Chinese perspective, peace is always to be treasured, and war is easy to start, but messy and almost impossible to end. And when you start a war, you do not know which course it will eventually happen. The war in Afghanistan, for example, lasted for 20 years, and eventually the Americans really cut off their tail and ran away, leaving the whole country in great mess, for example. And we want to make sure that all countries in the world do not use war as the first choice. We always want to pursue diplomacy. Therefore, my view is that if China spends a lot of resources on diplomacy, it's not a sign of weakness. And for those countries which really use war as the first choice, it's not a sign of real strength. I think we really need to focus on diplomacy, negotiation, rather than wasting human lives and wasting human resources on war. Now, finally, allow me to mention the fear in some Western countries about the rise of China. First of all, no one should deny or deprive the Chinese people of their legitimate rights of economic development. China achieved a profound transformation over the past 45 years, not by firing a single shot at any other country, not by colonizing any other piece of territory, not by taking over any piece of territory from any other countries. I think we really achieved the transformation through our sweat on our brow and through our hard work and ingenuity and the continued engagement with all the other countries. Between China and Canada, I do see a lot of complementarity, and I just hope Canada will not really wait for too long. And once Elon Musk's prediction really happens, China becomes about twice the size of the United States. Eventually, by the middle of this century, Canada will be probably too late if it decides to scramble into action. One of us mentioned Australia. Australia, under the new Prime Minister Albanese, is very much eager to restore the good neighborly relations between China and Australia. And I do hope Canada will start to do the same thing and restore friendship and cooperation between China and Canada going forward. I'm pretty sure there are no enemies in China against Canada. We are all friends, and we enjoy whatever Canada has to offer. And going forward, let's really become good neighbors across the Pacific Ocean and good partners of promoting free trade and exchanges of people between our two countries. Oh, by the way, allow me to mention one thing with the permission of all of you. I want to use this occasion to express my condolences to the family of Air Force Officer Bushnell. And I think we all need to give him our admiration for what he did. I think his last shout of not having anything to do with genocide against the people in Gaza is really speaking from the heart of all of us who really love peace. And I think the Palestinian people need to be treated as human beings as much as Israeli people need to be treated as human beings. And I think the legitimate rights of the Palestinian people should not be deprived, as the legitimate rights of the Israeli people should not be deprived. We need to deal with Israel on the par as we deal with Palestine. And the two-state solution is the only right solution. And the border of Palestinian people need to be restored back to the border of 1967. And East Jerusalem should be restored as the capital city of the state of Palestine. I think no one should really equivocate about these only right things that mankind is faced with. This will be the only way to really achieve lasting peace for Israel and for Palestine. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. That certainly brings us back down to earth. A very horrible and war-torn and genocidal earth. But anyway, okay, I will now go to Dimitri and then to Keith.
With respect to Linda's question about the allegations against Meng, that's a meaty subject beyond the scope of the time remaining to us. I'll just refer you, Linda, to an article on my website, which I wrote in 2020. My website's dimitrilascaris.org, and the somewhat colorful title is "Why the Trump Administration's Extradition Request Against Meng is a Farce." So if you want to learn more about the allegations and the so-called evidence to support them, I suggest you have a look at that article. I want very much to of our colleague Victor with respect to Aaron Bushnell. I have nothing to add to Victor's eloquent observations. I will, however, raise again, I'm sorry to be repetitive about this, but I find it mind-boggling that at this point in time, anyone from the West could assume the posture of moral superiority to any other state on earth. Mind-boggling. How can we possibly have the arrogance to criticize the human rights record of any other government when every single Western government, including the Canadian government, and above all, the hegemon who dominates Western politics, the United States, is brazenly, openly, enthusiastically committing an exercise in satanic genocidal behavior? That's the only way I can describe it. I mean, let's just stop and reflect, please, all of us, on our own behavior at this stage, at this critical and tragic point in human history, before we embark upon passing judgment on our supposed geopolitical adversaries. Thank you.
Thanks, Dimitri. Keith, please go ahead.
Yeah, I don't have much to say at this point. I'd like very much to echo what Victor and Dimitri have just said in paying tribute to Aaron Bushnell, who is my definition of a true American hero. I think it's very significant that the mainstream media in the West has tried to minimize its coverage of the sacrifice that he made, that so much of its commentary has focused on, to the extent that it exists, has featured utterly specious speculation on the state of his mental health, whereas the mental health of those who commit and abet and encourage and support genocide is not questioned. And I think that is a much more serious question if we're going to delve into those matters. And the fact that the media of the global south has given far more publicity to Aaron Bushnell than the Western media, I think contextualizes a lot of the hand-wringing and moral indignation, I would say faux moral indignation that was whipped up around the question of the two Michaels. I would say that just conclude on this, that obviously what Michael Spavor has suggested is that he gave information over drinks, it was said, to Michael Kovrig about the DPRK, about his dealings with Kim Jong-un, and that according to Michael Spavor, without his knowledge, that information was then passed to the intelligence agencies of Canada and the Five Eyes. Michael Kovrig in the chat here has put things saying that there is no litigation about this. That's not the main point. He didn't address the substantive issue. What Michael Kovrig has been quoted in the media as saying about Michael Spavor was, and I quote, "He knew he was talking to a diplomat." And I think it's worth keeping in mind that while he was at the International Crisis Group, Michael was on leave from the Canadian service. He hadn't left it. He says that in China, the other Michael, quote, "knew he was talking to a diplomat." He was not in China on a diplomatic visa, is my understanding, contrary again to some of the claims that have been made that the Chinese knew exactly that he was totally straightforward with the Chinese authorities about what he was doing there. And though unfortunately we had a lot of demands that Michael be allowed to speak in this webinar when he was given the opportunity, for whatever reason, which of course we should respect whatever reason he has, although he was very active in the chat, he chose not to exercise the invitation to speak here or to raise a question. So on that, I'd just like to echo what Alan said. There was a lot of demands on us that we should, almost an implication that we didn't have the right to choose which speakers we would wish to invite, but we invited everybody to speak who was here. If they chose not to speak, that's up to them. But those invitations are not extended to us, and that and almost in comparison to the sacrifice of that young man in the United States, this is almost a banal comparison, but it indicates that just as his sacrifice is almost completely ignored in the Western media, the voices of those who would seek to articulate a different point of view, a point of view that I would say reflects the views and interests of the global majority, is not given adequate. We're not invited to debate and discuss with those people. Yet the demand is then placed on us that we should give them a platform. We were quite willing to do so in this webinar. But I hope other people have found something to think about and to take away from this meeting. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Keith. And I'll just say 2 or 3 minutes worth, and then we'll bring this event to an end. I just wanted to, what I have to say is best connected, I think, with what Dimitri was saying about the West having no right to claim any moral superiority over anyone else. But the reason why the West has been able to claim moral superiority, or the discourses on the strength of which it claims moral superiority, are discourses that are generated, for example, in the field of international relations, where it seems to me that the function of realism is to simply equate all states to one another without asking what really those states are about, because essentially the idea is that if other states are not as bad as the United States, they would be if they could be. That's the general idea. But of course, China is already showing that China is today very powerful, but it has a very, very different foreign policy stance, as, by the way, did the Soviet Union while it existed. And the reason I bring this up is that, you know, decades ago, Max Horkheimer, before he went over to the dark side, I should add, is supposed to have said that those who do not wish to speak about capitalism should remain silent about fascism. That is to say, you cannot have a discourse about fascism in which you do not bring in capitalism. I would say today that those who do not wish to discuss imperialism should remain silent about international relations. The reason why China is so important is that it was not the first, but it was certainly the second major socialist revolution. In an imperialist context, socialist revolutions were the sine qua non for the healthy development and the productive development of any society, as the Soviet Union showed, and today as China shows. China has developed, that is to say, it has increased its productive capacity in a completely historically unprecedented way, because the vast majority of today's rich countries were either themselves imperialist, they benefited from the exploitation of other countries, which then directly contributed to their development and their increases in their productive capacity and all that, and their current prosperity. Whereas China not only has developed without that luxury of imperialism, it has developed in the face, in the teeth of imperialist resistance, and today represents the biggest challenge to that imperialist world. And I think that that is why China is so important. That is why Meng Wanzhou was arrested as part of a whole range of anti-China action, which we have all been discussing. So I would say that if you don't wish to discuss imperialism, then you should not be saying anything about international relations. And imperialism today stems directly from capitalism. And today, the kind of desperate imperialism that we are looking at stems from a declining and increasingly senile capitalism. So I hope that you have, like Keith was saying, you got a lot out of this. This video, if you would like to share it, will remain on the International Manifesto Group YouTube channel. Please feel free to share it more widely. Let's hope that people get to see it and learn of a different way of looking at the world, which is more productive, more peaceful, more ecologically sustainable than the one that is being offered to us by the ruling elites of the major imperialist countries of the world. Thank you very much. And with that, I'd like to bring this very memorable event to a close. Thanks very much to
Can any of the organizers
Radhika,
see
can I have
there's no
final
indigenous
words?
inclusion in this call? Can it?
Okay, yes, Victor, please go ahead.
Can I have a word? Very quick word.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll be
Why
very
is there
quick.
no indigenous inclusion in this call? Answer the question.
Let me have a very quick word. I think for the two Michaels, Michael Spavor and Michael Kovrig, I hope when all the dust settles, the two Michaels will come back to China for a look. And I don't think there is any bad feelings between the Chinese people and the two Michaels. And I hope we will get along with each other, and the two Michaels will be welcomed back to China eventually after all the dust settles. And we will deal with each other as it is, and we will promote peace and good relations between China and Canada, as we all need to do. Thank you. Thank you, Radhika.
Thanks very much, Victor. That's a great note to end on. So thanks again to everyone. Thanks to Victor, thanks to Keith and Dimitri, and thanks to Paul, of course, our videographer. And please look out for our next event, which will be about Russia and Russia's foreign policy, which is coming up in 2 weeks. So please follow us and please like and share this video as well more widely. Okay, thank you very much and goodbye.
Bye-bye, everyone. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you all.